The morning sunlight poured through the towering windows of the Harrington townhouse on Beacon Hill, spilling across polished marble and catching in the crystal edges of the chandelier. Clara Harrington stood at the counter, her hands still, eyes tracing the Boston skyline beyond the glass. The city gleamed with quiet, inherited power, cobblestone streets, iron balconies, and old families who didn't have to flaunt their wealth because it was carved into every stone around them. But for Clara, it always felt borrowed. 2 years had passed since she'd moved here, and the silence of the mansion still pressed down on her, beautiful, cold, and unwelcoming. Behind her came the familiar rhythm of heels. Margaret Harrington entered, regal as ever, silk robe tied neatly, hair perfectly swept, perfume arriving before her voice. She carried a slim leather folder, her every movement deliberate and graceful. "The caterers will arrive at 5, Margaret began without greeting. "Make sure the floral arrangements are exactly as I instructed. White lilies, not those rustic wildflowers you chose last time." "Yes, Mrs. Harrington," Clara said softly, lowering her gaze. Margaret set the folder down and flipped through a few pages. "Tonight is important. The guest list includes judges, investors, and the deputy mayor. You're to smile, stay polite, and let Henry do the introductions. This isn't the sort of evening where idle chatter is welcome." Her tone was civil, but the sting beneath it was sharp. "Know your place." "I understand," Clara murmured. Margaret finally looked up, her cool eyes studying her daughter-in-law's calm expression. "Good. You have a tendency to overshare, dear. People from small towns often don't understand discretion." Clara forced a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll remember that." Satisfied, Margaret gave a short nod. "See that you do." She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Oh, and wear something understated tonight. We wouldn't want anyone thinking you're trying to fit in." When the echo of her heels faded up the marble staircase, the kitchen fell silent again. Clara stayed motionless, staring at the gold light gliding over the counter. Every conversation with Margaret was a masterclass in refined cruelty, perfectly wrapped insults, everyone disguised as advice. Her phone buzzed. She almost jumped. When she saw the name, her breath caught. Uncle Nathan. "Uncle Nate," she said, her voice trembling with relief. "Clara, sweetheart," came the warm, gravelly tone of Wyoming. "Didn't mean to call so early, but I thought you'd want to know. It's done." Her heart lurched. "You mean?" "Yes," he said, voice steady. "The court signed the final order yesterday. The Harrington Ranch, all 480 acres of it, is legally yours again, every inch of it. The land's finally back under the family's name." For a moment, Clara couldn't speak. The ranch, her grandfather's land, stolen decades ago, had finally been returned. A history of injustice undone with one signature. "I don't even know what to say," she whispered. "Don't say anything yet." He hesitated. "Your mother would be proud, Clara. But listen, tonight's that woman's birthday, isn't it?" Clara blinked. "Margaret's, yes. She's hosting some kind of showcase, city officials, developers, the usual." Nathan's low hum was thoughtful. "Then that's perfect." A chill rippled through her. "Uncle Nate, what are you planning?" He chuckled softly, but there was weight behind it. "Let's just say it's time the truth stood in the same room as their lies." The line clicked, leaving Clara standing alone in the kitchen, her pulse quickening. She looked around at the perfection of the Harrington estate, the gleaming countertops, the monogrammed china, the sterile air of prestige. For the first time, it didn't intimidate her. It looked fragile. She set her phone down, whispering to herself, "It's time." The next call from Nathan came an hour later. His tone carried the calm certainty she had leaned on all her life. 480 acres confirmed, he said. "The land near Sheridan, the one your great-grandfather donated to the state back in the 50s. The judge upheld the reversion clause. It's yours again, fair and square." Clara turned toward the window. Her reflection was faint, framed by sunlight. "So, it's really over?" "Legally, yes," Nathan replied. "But in truth, that depends on what you do next." Clara could picture him in his dusty office back home, light falling across yellowed documents and old family photos. "I'd like to make it public," he said finally. "Not through the press, too impersonal. It needs to happen in the right room, with the right people listening." Her stomach tightened. You're not thinking of— I am, he interrupted gently. You've spent 2 years swallowing their contempt. Tonight, you don't have to anymore. She closed her eyes, the hum of Boston's traffic faint beyond the glass. You've carried their arrogance on your back long enough, Clara, he said. Tonight, the truth speaks for you. When the call ended, she stood quietly, one hand pressed against her heart. Outside, the world moved on. Horns, footsteps, the city breathing. Inside, something within her shifted. She turned to the mirror above the sideboard. The woman looking back was not the same one who had arrived in Boston, naive, nervous, eager to please. She remembered those early dinners, every conversation and examination, every smile measured. Margaret's snide remarks disguised as jokes. People from small towns have such charmingly simple dreams. Henry's uncomfortable silence when his mother mocked her. The servants who took their cues from the matriarch, polite but never warm. There were nights she'd sat alone in the guest parlor, staring down at Beacon Hill's narrow streets, listening to laughter drift from other rooms where she didn't belong. But those nights had built something inside her, a quiet, steady resolve. She looked into the mirror again. The reflection staring back wasn't meek. It was steel. Upstairs, the faint echo of Margaret's voice floated through the house, directing, correcting, controlling. Unaware that the stage she'd built for her own grandeur was about to host her reckoning. Clara straightened, her pulse steady now. The farm girl from Wyoming was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned to smile through humiliation, and tonight, that smile would mean something entirely different. By late afternoon, the Harrington townhouse was no longer a home, but a stage. Staff scurried from room to room, the air thick with the scent of lilies and polished wood. Margaret commanded the space like a conductor, clipboard in hand, every instruction crisp. The crystal goblets on the right, please. And someone check the chandeliers. I won't have fingerprints showing in candlelight. Henry followed her, nodding quietly, his tie still loose, eyes tired. Clara moved silently through the background, dressed in the black gown Margaret had approved. Simple, elegant, safe. To look modest, not desperate, Margaret had said earlier. The words rolled off Clara now. The house gleamed as the sun began to fade. Through the tall windows, Beacon Hill glowed gold, old money glimmering like it always had. By 6, the caterers arrived. Trays of hors d'oeuvres, bottles of champagne, the pianist softly testing keys in the corner. The evening shimmered, expensive, empty, and cold. Clara passed the grand hallway mirror once more. The woman reflected there looked calm, poised, but in her eyes, something waited, something patient, something final. By the time the first guests arrived, the house had transformed into a cathedral of glass and whispers. Chandeliers glimmered like constellations above polished marble, laughter echoed faintly through the hallways, and the smell of lilies mixed with perfume, worth more than most people's yearly rent. Everything was perfect, as Margaret Harrington demanded. Clara stood at the edge of the foyer beside Henry, offering polite smiles to strangers who saw her not as a person, but as a footnote in someone else's story. "Ah, you're Henry's wife," they said, eyes flicking over her dress, her posture, her accent. A judgment disguised as curiosity. "From— where was it again? Wyoming?" "Yes," she answered evenly. "A long way from Beacon Hill." They laughed softly as if it were a punchline. In the drawing room, Margaret was in her element, surrounded by Boston's elite, her laughter sharp and effortless. "Harrington Development," she was saying, voice carrying just enough to reach every corner, "is expanding west. We've secured rights to a beautiful stretch of land in Wyoming. Untouched, vast, a perfect opportunity for the next generation of investors." The name Wyoming hit Clara like a whisper through her spine. Her fingers tightened around her glass. She kept her gaze steady, pretending to listen to some meaningless conversation beside her, but every word from Margaret cut deeper. "That's my home. That's my land." She inhaled quietly and turned away before her expression betrayed her. Henry noticed her distance but didn't speak. He never did when it came to his mother. He had inherited Margaret's silence but none of her cruelty, a man born into privilege and guilt in equal measure. By 7, the house buzzed with life. Waiters passed through the crowd with silver trays. The pianist's soft jazz filled the air, and the golden glow of wealth blurred reality. To anyone watching, it was a night of celebration. To Clara, it was the calm before an earthquake. In the mirror-lined hallway, she caught her reflection once more, the woman she had become standing in the middle of the life she no longer needed, and she smiled, because she knew something none of them did. The clock chimed 8. The front door opened. The murmur of conversation dimmed as Nathan Lewis stepped inside. He didn't belong there, and that was precisely why every head turned. He wore a simple gray suit, neatly pressed but old. His hair was silvered by years of Wyoming sun, his hands still rough from a life of work, not wealth. In one, he carried a bouquet of wildflowers, the kind that grew near Clara's childhood ranch. In the other, a worn leather briefcase. The silence stretched. Margaret was the first to recover, her hostess's instinct snapping into place. "Well," she said, her voice smooth, "what an unexpected surprise." Nathan smiled kindly, his eyes steady. "For the lady of the house," he said, extending the flowers. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Harrington." Her lips tightened, but she accepted them. "How thoughtful," she murmured, handing them off to a waiter as though they might soil the crystal tableware. "Please make sure these are placed somewhere discreet." Clara moved forward, her composure unbroken. "Uncle Nate," she said softly, "come in." Her heart pounded beneath her ribs, but her voice remained calm. He followed her to a quiet corner near the fireplace where the chatter began to resume. The guests pretended to ignore him, though more than a few exchanged looks. To them, Nathan was an intruder, a shadow from a world they'd only read about in history books. A man nearby whispered to his wife, "Who invited the ranch hand?" Nathan heard, but didn't react. He simply unbuttoned his coat, placed the briefcase beside his chair, and folded his weathered hands in his lap. "You didn't have to come all this way," Clara said quietly. He smiled. Some truths don't travel well by email. Across the room, Margaret raised her glass, reclaiming attention like a queen restoring order. "Now, as I was saying," she declared brightly, "our next development project is something truly remarkable. We've acquired nearly 500 acres of open land in Wyoming, a place so untouched it's practically waiting to be reborn." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Clara felt the room tilt. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The land. Her land. She turned slightly, catching Nathan's gaze from across the room. He gave the smallest nod. Margaret continued, smiling as though she had written history herself. "It's remarkable, really, transforming something so barren into something beautiful. Of course, one must have the vision to see potential where others see dust." The words were casual to her, but to Clara they sounded like theft-given voice. She wanted to speak, to shout, but Nathan's calm hand brushed her arm under the table. "Wait," he whispered. The evening carried on, every clink of glass and burst of laughter scraping against Clara's nerves. The pianist's music had turned slower now, almost mournful. The house looked perfect, but something in the air had changed. When dinner began, the guests gathered around the long mahogany table. Candles burned low, casting golden halos across crystal and silver. Margaret presided at the head, radiant and smug. They toasted her birthday, to her success, to her charm. And then, inevitably, someone brought up Clara. Margaret's smile sharpened. "Oh, we simply adore Clara," she said sweetly, so refreshingly unpolished. A few polite laughs followed. "She's been such a delight to have around the house," Margaret continued. "Why, when she first came from Wyoming, she asked me if she could plant potatoes on the balcony." She laughed, bright and brittle. "I told her, 'Darling, this is Beacon Hill, not a barnyard.'" Laughter spread like wildfire, some genuine, some uncomfortable. Henry shifted beside Clara, murmuring, "Mom, that's enough." "Oh, nonsense," Margaret said lightly, waving him off. "It's just a story." Clara didn't flinch. Her expression remained neutral, but Nathan saw the steel in her eyes. Margaret took a sip of wine, emboldened by her audience. "Life is funny, isn't it? Our new project happens to be on the very land near her hometown. I suppose it's poetic, turning those old potato fields into luxury estates." A ripple of laughter followed, weaker this time. Even the guests could feel the temperature drop. Clara's hand trembled, but not from shame, from control. She was holding back the storm. "Don't worry, dear," Margaret added with mock sympathy. "We'll build something tasteful. Maybe we'll even name one of the streets after your family. Lewis Lane, perhaps? That did it. The last of the laughter died. The silence that followed was thick and uneasy. Nathan's fingers brushed the edge of his briefcase. Across the table, Clara met his eyes and nodded once. Margaret, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, smiled brightly and raised her glass. Anyway, she said, it's a rather empty area now, but with the right vision, we can make it shine. To progress. To progress, echoed George Whitmore, one of her investors, forcing a smile. It wasn't loud or dramatic. He rose with quiet purpose, his chair scraping softly against the floor. But the simple act commanded silence. Every head turned. Even the pianist stopped playing. He looked down the table, his gaze landing on Margaret. Forgive the interruption, he said calmly. But I believe you've made a mistake. Margaret blinked, still smiling, though her eyes had cooled. I beg your pardon? Nathan rested one hand on the back of his chair. You mentioned a parcel of land, 480 acres outside Sheridan, Wyoming? Yes, she said carefully. Why? He opened his briefcase, pulling out a stack of papers bound neatly with a thin leather strap. Because that land isn't yours. The murmurs began instantly. Margaret's smile faltered. I think you're mistaken, sir. We acquired that property legally from the state. Nathan's eyes didn't waver. You acquired air, not land. He spread the documents on the table, the sound of paper on mahogany sharp and final. The reversion clause your lawyers ignored was upheld by the state court 3 days ago. The land you're planning to develop has reverted to its original heirs. He turned toward Clara, to her. The silence was absolute. Margaret's glass slipped slightly in her hand. What nonsense is this? Nathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Not nonsense, ma'am. Law. Clara finally rose, her expression calm, almost serene. The land you called barren, she said softly, has been in my family for generations. The same family you've mocked since I set foot in this house. Her words landed like quiet thunder. Margaret's eyes darted from Clara to Nathan, searching for some trace of bluff. This is outrageous. Nathan held up the court seal at the top of the document. No, Mrs. Harrington, this is justice. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound in the grand dining room was the faint hum of the chandelier above, its light flickering off crystal and polished silver. Every guest froze mid-motion, their eyes darting between Nathan's calm face and Margaret's paling one. Margaret recovered first, or tried to. Her composure cracked like porcelain, but she forced a brittle laugh. Surely this is some kind of misunderstanding. Henry, dear, call the attorney. There's no misunderstanding, Nathan said quietly. Your company attempted to purchase state land that was never truly theirs to sell. That ranch was donated by Clara's great-grandfather under a reversion clause. When your developers missed that fine print, the land automatically reverted to her family's name. And now, he tapped the documents gently, it's officially titled to Clara Lewis Harrington. A murmur swept through the table. Glasses clinked nervously, and someone coughed to fill the silence. The pianist's hands hovered over the keys but didn't dare play. Margaret's eyes turned cold. You expect me to believe this? This farce? That some dusty technicality makes her the owner of land we rightfully acquired? Nathan's voice remained steady. You can believe whatever you like. But if your firm proceeds with the project, you'll be building mansions on property you don't own. And when that hits the news, I imagine the investors sitting here tonight might not appreciate being tied to fraud. The word fraud hit the room like thunder. Across the table, one of the investors, the same man who had toasted to progress minutes earlier, slowly lowered his glass. Another exchanged a look with his wife, both quietly mortified. Henry's jaw tightened. Mom, he said quietly. He's telling the truth. She snapped her head toward him. You stay out of this. But Henry didn't. He stood, pushing back his chair. His voice was low but firm. I've seen the filings. I checked the company records last week. The ownership line is clean. It's Clara's. They missed the clause completely. Margaret turned scarlet. You knew? I suspected, Henry said, his voice cracking slightly. I didn't know until now. Clara finally spoke, her tone soft but cutting. It doesn't matter who knew, Margaret. What matters is what happens next. Margaret's throat bobbed. And what exactly do you want? Clara stepped around the table, every movement deliberate, every eye following her. The candles painted soft light along her black dress, giving her the quiet grace of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. "For 2 years," she began, "I've eaten at this table and listened to you belittle me. You laughed at my home, my family, and my roots. You told me to know my place." She smiled faintly. "I do now. My place isn't beneath you. It's far beyond you." Her words settled like dust, quiet and inescapable. Margaret opened her mouth to retort, but nothing came out. The crowd of guests sat frozen, torn between pity and fascination. Nathan leaned back slightly, arms crossed, letting the silence burn. Clara continued, her voice unwavering. "You called Wyoming barren land, but that soil holds generations of work and honor, things money can't buy. My grandfather gave it freely, believing it would help others, and your company tried to turn it into a playground for the rich." She looked around the table, her gaze sweeping across every face. "That land is mine now, and I intend to restore it, to turn it into something real. Not another monument to greed, but a sanctuary for the people who still remember what home means." The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Then she turned back to Margaret, who sat motionless, fingers clutching her wine glass like a weapon. "I came into this house thinking I needed your approval. I don't anymore. I don't need your name. I don't need your money. And I certainly don't need your parties." She glanced at Nathan, who gave her a slow nod. Clara reached into the folder Nathan had brought and pulled out one final document, a notarized transfer certificate. She placed it gently in front of Margaret. "Since I know how much you like appearances, I thought you'd appreciate this." Margaret stared down at the paper, confusion etched into her features. "It's a letter," Clara explained, "authorizing a full audit of Harrington Development's Western acquisitions. It's already been sent to the state attorney's office." A stunned hush swept through the guests. "Every deal you made," Clara continued softly, "every donation, every favor, it's all going to be reviewed." Margaret's voice cracked for the first time that night. "You wouldn't dare." Clara tilted her head, her eyes steady. "Oh, but I already have." Nathan's voice filled the quiet. "Your son signed it as a witness, Mrs. Harrington. I believe he's quite ready for your company to start running honestly." The color drained from Margaret's face. She looked at Henry, betrayal and disbelief warring in her expression. But Henry didn't look away. "You've controlled everyone in this house for too long," he said simply. "It's time that ended." Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. The sound rang sharp and final. Across the table, the guests shifted uncomfortably. The pianist finally began to play again, softly, awkwardly, trying to fill the silence. Clara turned toward them, her voice calm but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think that concludes tonight's celebration. Thank you for coming." No one argued. They began to rise, murmuring polite excuses, avoiding Margaret's stare as they moved toward the foyer. One by one, they slipped out into the cold Boston night, their laughter replaced by uneasy whispers. When the last of them was gone, only Clara, Henry, Nathan, and Margaret remained. Margaret sank slowly into her chair, staring at the untouched cake on the table. Her perfect night lay in ruins, her pride, her power, her carefully constructed image all shattered like the glass at her feet. Nathan closed his briefcase and stood. "You always told her to know her place," he said quietly. "Now she does." He turned to Clara. "Come on, kiddo. Time to go home." Clara hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting Henry's. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "for all of it, for not speaking sooner." She gave him a small, sad smile. "I know, but some lessons we have to learn the hard way." Then she turned and walked toward the door. Nathan followed, his footsteps steady behind hers. Outside, the city lights flickered off the damp cobblestones. The air smelled of rain and redemption. At the end of the driveway, Clara paused, glancing back at the towering townhouse one last time. The windows still glowed, but the warmth inside had died. She whispered to herself, "It's over." Nathan smiled beside her. "No, sweetheart, it's just beginning." They walked away together, the night wrapping around them like a promise. Weeks later, the story broke across every major business journal in New England. Harrington Development under investigation for fraudulent land acquisition. Margaret vanished from society luncheons. Henry quietly took over the company, restructuring it from the inside. And Clara returned to Wyoming, her name on the deed, her spirit unbroken. The land she stood on was hers again, but it was more than property now. It was freedom. On the ranch's open fields, the morning light touched every blade of grass, just as it had when she was a child. The mountains in the distance stood proud and still. Clara breathed in the cold air and smiled. For the first time in years, the silence around her wasn't suffocating. It was peace. She whispered to the wind, her voice carried across the plains. They told me to know my place. Now they'll never forget it. And somewhere back in Boston, in a dark, quiet townhouse filled with echoes, Margaret Harrington finally understood what true power looked like. It wasn't money. It wasn't